أهلاً وسهلاً بكم في هذه.
Welcome to the last session of Radical Fridays. Over the last 12 months, this series has been a rich journey of exploring, learning, thinking together about different traditions and experiments in radical education. It has been an inspiring journey that has explored ways of doing radical education in different settings, in schools and outside, universities, and the space of the nation itself, with different age groups, children, women, and otherwise, and in different fields, art, music, embroidery, walking, publishing, reading, and many other topics. We have learned that there is no one form of radical education, and that it is situated and contextualized. And we also learned how to reject the one-size-fits-all forms of education. We also hope that these experiments that were presented in the previous webinars and many others will inspire many of us to pursue different forms. We have embraced a broad umbrella case definition of what is meant by radical education, and it is composed of three core elements, namely a critical and structural analysis of a problem and looking at the roots. Second, a utopian imagination of the worlds we want to create. And third, careful strategic attention to the way to reach from here to there, from what we imagine, from where we are to the world that we want to create. In this session, this last session, we will look back to move forward. What can be learned from these experiments, and how can we link them together for the public good? We chose to focus on national liberation despite the problematics of the concept of nationalism. But we are thinking of national liberation in a broader sense, and not in the narrower sense of nationalism, but the broader, more encompassing term of self-determination, autonomous communes, national liberation that is encompassing of all other sorts of liberation, women, colonialism, ageism, racism, etc. Since we started the webinar series thinking of how we can deploy different traditions of radical education in order to create a better, more just world, and to create a radical new political imagination, we will focus on four themes today. We will proceed by proposing the themes, and each speaker will be given 5 minutes to engage with the theme from her own experiences and work. And then we will have a conversation between the different perspectives. We will end the session with receiving questions from the audience. So please post your questions in the chat, and we will try to pose all these questions before the session ends.
سيكون هناك وفي حال رغبتكم بتقديم مداخلة مباشرة يرجى ترك ملاحظة.
If you want to make an intervention, please also leave a note on the chat and you will be invited as a panelist. Please note that we have interpretation today into Arabic and English. To choose your channel, please click on the globe button at the bottom of your Zoom app. Welcome again. And it is our honor today to have a wonderful group of speakers, namely Gustavo Esteva, Munir Fashe, Nisreen Abdelal, Nabila Espagnoli, and Abahir As-Saqqa. I will not introduce them because you can see it in the announcement of the webinar. I will start with the first topic, and that is, how do you understand the different traditions of radical education? How do our guests understand the different traditions of radical education? So for each speaker, how do you look at your work as part of the tradition of radical education? We will start with Nabila, perhaps. Hello to everyone, all the participants and the attendees. I think that radical education, to me, is a liberation education. It's a type of education. It's about the dream, a dream of the future. And it is connected to values. And that we practice on a daily basis with the people that we work with, our beneficiaries. Preserving memory is the preservation of roots, of identity. For Palestinians within 1948, this is extremely important because official educational institutions do not talk about identity and developing national identity. So for us, it's important to work on identity and memory from early childhood. We do that through activities and projects, and primarily through strengthening the Palestinian national identity of our children and community through dismantling the concept of identity and reconstructing it again, because the question is, how do we define identity? How do we do that with the respect to the components of identity? When we looked at that, we thought, okay, what are these components? And in early childhood, we thought it's different aspects through food, through songs, through the environment, through nature, through music and culture. So developing and strengthening and developing resources that respect this heritage, this rich heritage of the Palestinian people is part and parcel of developing this identity. And then we look at releasing the potential of the dream. The question was, how do we contribute to launching this dream? To have a liberation, radical ideology by believing in ourselves, believing in our children, believing in our environment, and to develop new projects. For example, we have a series about the villages that remain. This was part of our attempt to preserve the roots and develop and build the dream. There's also the methodology that we use. The methodology that we use with the groups that we work with. Usually we focus on changing the discourse. In our context, there are many attempts to use the discourse of the victim, but we want to change that from the discourse of a victim to a discourse of responsibility, of awareness, to not use the discourse of needs, but to use the discourse of rights. Our right, our ability and the need for us to demand our rights, to struggle for our rights. All of these are components of the liberation work that we do in our educational projects, working with youth, working with women, working with society, and developing resources that talk about Palestine, that speak Palestinian, and enable children and all Palestinians to understand their identity and develop their identity and change their reality towards the dream that we are building. Thank you, Nabila. Abaher, can you please start? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be in such good company. My contribution is more humble than that of Nabila, because as a university professor, my relationship to liberation ideology or education is different. I want to talk about certain difficulties that we face and how do we collectively work on solving this problem. We have a problem in the global south whereby we do not have any research that go beyond the colonizer, and we don't have a discourse, an anti-colonial discourse. And we are still working on the liberation of the whole society. We still share with our colleagues in the global south and also the rest of the world this question about how do we create our own community-based knowledge that is distant from the Western-centric knowledge. We still don't have our own original knowledge. We don't have our own research tools. So part of what I want to share is this conflict and this discussion about sources of knowledge, as well as the discussions about liberation ideology, about alternative education. We have a real problem of how to deal with these forces. Knowledge, from my perspective at the university, has the problematic of who produces knowledge, for whom do we produce this knowledge? Is it targeting academics or a minority? What language do you use to produce this knowledge? A few days ago, I was speaking in a presentation about the illusion of the state. We are under occupation and we still imagine that we have a state, we have a country. We have universities that love international classifications and that kind of competition, even though a large number of universities around the world are outside classification. There is a problem with this Western classification of universities. And you know that the majority of these universities are private universities. There is a crisis that universities around the world face. And of course, ours too, most of education is in English. And this has an impact on the quality of production and production of knowledge. There are democratic approaches that aim to produce knowledge that aligns with the logic of the marketplace. We at the university may not be able to go beyond that, but we try to be critical towards it. So we have a lot of crises. We have a lot of issues in the Palestinian society, for example, the relationship between the university with its society. What kind of knowledge do we produce? Our relationship with the social authority, political authority, as well as the occupation that also tries to hinder and place obstacles in front of our knowledge. So the dilemma for us is how to learn, how to think, and to think what and why are we thinking about certain issues and not others? Is the problem connected to the tools or the product? Is a problem with our methodology and our relationship with the topics that we study and research? How, for example, and I'm trying to connect with what Nabila said, how do we reclaim voluntary work, learning from experiences, to reclaim indigenous knowledge? How do we go beyond dealing with society as a laboratory, to go beyond empirical knowledge and unidirectional knowledge and teaching? This requires us to reconsider the rules for education, university, and school, the concept of competition. And what do we do with critical knowledge? Can we develop our own knowledge? Do we align with other experiences? And here I'd like to point, of course, to those who are aware of these. So there are different schools in Asia, for example, that try to create a rooted knowledge that is connected to its society, to the language that it is produced in. So all of these issues are a test for us as academics. It's a difficult test because many of us cannot do that. And we have discussion circles, reflection circles, but we don't really go beyond that. We don't go beyond this reflection. We do have discussion circles, seminars where a group of our critical colleagues meet on a regular basis, but these discussions do not lead to knowledge that impacts society. I feel, and I think my colleagues, the academics in other universities also feel that there is a gap between knowledge and society, and this gap is reflected in this in universities. We have a real crisis, the reproduction of colonial violence as community violence, and we see this violence happening in universities, and you are all aware, at least the ones living in Palestine, you're all aware of what's happening in Palestinian universities. There is an aggression against academic freedom, against the universities themselves. There are attempts to control it. It's not just a struggle between the different political factions, which has been going for many years, but we're going downhill, and this we have a structural problem within Palestinian society. I am one of the people who has to bear this responsibility because of this gap between us as academics and society. In other words, the community of knowledge is divided into two parts. The community knowledge that is undermined, and the university knowledge that is held with esteem, and Maysoon, I think I have one more minute. In this last minute, I'd like to call upon everyone to go beyond these international ranking and to stop creating knowledge for the market. What is happening in Palestine is very similar to what's happening in other universities around the world. Thinking of specializations that are suitable for the market, for the job market, is so strange because it assumes that there is a Palestinian market. And sometimes I hear officials, education officials, talking about having graduates aligned with the needs of the market, but we don't have a Palestinian market. This is an illusion that is connected to the illusion of the state. There are repercussions, and we need to think that we are living in a community that is colonized. We need to reclaim learning versus education. We need to reclaim voluntary education and to think of our society in different ways. We need to go beyond the concept of classifications and competition, because that's just a waste of time. Our society needs us to produce knowledge, and we can talk about that later in the other interventions. I think my 5 minutes are up. Thank you. Perhaps now it's a good opportunity to move to Gustavo, because he has an experience, a different type of university experience that might respond to some of the questions posed by Abahir in another context, and that is Mexico, and the experience with the Zapatistas, with the post-colonial state. Gustavo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Maysoon. Thank you, Munir. Thank you for inviting me to this marvelous days. First of all, I said, when I first heard Munir talking about radical education, I thought that he was describing us, that he was talking about us in University of the Earth. I like it particularly when he was saying that radical education literally means unplugging oneself from metaphysical words, meanings, knowledge, and returning to the roots. Yes, that is the idea. And particularly when he said it's returning to what has been stolen from us and made invisible, looking for wisdom instead of truth. Yes, I like that very much. And I like it particularly when he described radical education associated with the soils that form the source of living, learning, and personal communal nurturance. I could not avoid but remembering a marvelous conversation between Jean Robert and the subcomandante Marcos in a Zapatista event, when they spent 1 hour in a marvelous discussion about the soils needed for every theory, how the theory is like soils usually, and how you need to reconstruct the soils of every theory. I like all that. I really think I feel myself identified with everything you are talking about. But at the same time, I wonder why you are still using the word education. We are not using the word education. We are escaping from education. We are abandoning all idea of formulating any kind of obedience or creating homogeneity or trying to shape the people in a certain way. We are not teaching. We are not having curricula. We are abandoning all the goals and the methods of education. But we are doing everything you say you are doing. Then we feel in family, we feel very comfortable talking with you, with what you are doing. And of course, this is in radical contrast to what is being done in the system of education. We started when the indigenous peoples of Oaxaca, the University of there was created, when they said that the school was the main tool of the state to destroy the indigenous people. And that is an historical truth. The education was created in Mexico in the 19th century to de-Indianize the Indians, to destroy their indigenous soul. And they succeeded with millions and millions of people that entered the education system as indigenous people and left transformed in something else with their indigenous soul destroyed, demolished, dismantled. That is the function of education. And then the indigenous people in Mexico said, basta, enough, we don't want more of that. And the communities started to close schools. And you can imagine the scandal. These barbarians, they are depriving, they are dooming their children to ignorance, but they started to follow a different path, a clear path of liberation, abandoning that very idea of education, of formatting and shaping the people in a certain way. Yes, we are following, we are described by Munir when he talks about radical education. We are following that specific path, but we are not using the word. We are escaping from education. We are basically, our main principle in our university is learning in freedom by doing what you want to learn. And that is exactly what we are doing. And of course, that means a struggle. We are involved in all kinds of struggles because that is what we want to learn, how to struggle, how to create the liberation. We are learning how to do that, learning in freedom by doing exactly what we want to do, what we want to learn. That is my affiliation mission.
Thank you, Gustavo. بس بدي أقول إنه نحن ما كنا عم
Thank you, Gustavo. We weren't talking about education in the close sense of learning and teaching. Education in Arabic means upbringing. It's about any experience of learning in society. So the term we use in Arabic is not education, but it's more so learning. And mostly outside the context of school, we don't disagree. In Arabic, the term that we use, which is tarbiyah, goes beyond education, but we can't find a term in English to translate tarbiyah except education. And we also said that we don't use this term when we say tarbiyah. It's not connected to teaching. We're using it in the context of learning. So maybe now we can move to Munir to complement what Gustavo just started. 5 minutes, Munir. I'd like to start from the degeneration that I find in humanity since 1100 years. The Arabs started the first university, and it was called Bayt al-Hikmah, which is the House of Wisdom. Currently, Harvard is considered the top university whose slogan is truth. Veritas. I think this is a degeneration, and I think we need to get rid of it, because the word truth, well, we can't say anybody has, it just means that nobody has the truth. They have to go to Harvard to find the truth. And if you disagree with them, you're doomed. And this is what happened to me. Some of you may know this, but I mean, that's another story. The question now here is, how can a nation starting with wisdom, that started with wisdom, establishing the first university on the basis of wisdom, and then give that up and accept truth as a slogan? In 2010, I sent a letter to all Palestinian universities suggesting that they establish a house of wisdom, Bayt al-Hikmah, in every university for 10 students only. 10 students who do not wish to go through the path of courses. They want to go on the path of wisdom. Not one single university even responded to that letter, or to say, we're not interested. This is a stupid suggestion, taking us backward. No, they didn't even respond. They felt that this suggestion was so irrelevant to the extent that nobody answered. And some presidents of universities, I called them and they said, oh, sorry, we were busy and stuff. The only one who was interested in this was Nibal Thawabte, who's the editor of Al-Hal magazine in Birzeit University. She published it in the magazine. That was in 2011. And then it was in the issue published 1st of February 2011. She posted this proposal that I sent, but alas, no one responded. The problem, in my opinion, is that liberation education or emancipatory education is means getting out of the feeling that we are less and to reclaim the knowledge of our value. And this is not, these are not my words. These are the words of Al-Imam Ali. Al-Imam Ali, hundreds of years ago, said that a person who knows his value will not perish. And I would like to add this and to say, and I think that this should be the title, no man who knows his value will perish. And we can say the same about any nation or community or civilization, that if they know their value, they will never perish. Our civilization, they've managed to convince us that we have no value, that we are of no value. So for me, liberation or emancipatory education or radical education that goes in the roots is to reclaim, is putting effort in reclaiming our value.
We have to start putting a plan and a strategy for education in our countries. Let us take Thomas Macaulay. Thomas Macaulay wrote, I have never found one among those whom I have consulted who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. He had set a plan for education in India, then he adds. So you can see that he's not even talking about a library, just a shelf. One shelf is worth more than everything has been written in Arabic or in Hindi. Then he chose two civilizations that are extremely rich. Then he adds that the way to teach the Indians, we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern.
Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. We have to educate them. فيش أوضح من هيك. والوضوح واضح.
So it's very obvious, it's very clear. And today, I think all Palestinian universities agree with this discourse. We all have Arab faces, Arab blood, but our taste, our intellect, and our self-appreciation are to the West. What's nice in my life is that I was born in Palestine, and I have always carried all the problems of Palestine along with all the hopes of Palestine. The war of 1967 is part of my history, but after 67, in 76, I noticed that my mom does not know the alphabet. I do not like the word illiterate, so she does not know the alphabet, but she can do math that I myself do not understand. And all the professionals in mathematics would not beat her in calculus. And I wrote about this. I wrote about this and I was inspired by what I have witnessed. I do not know sorry, we have to interrupt you because you need to be brief. Okay, so what I would like to explain here is that we have a wealth of richness, be it from the past or the wealth we have from the present, but we find nothing on the Intifada, neither in the school curricula nor elsewhere. Chomsky in '88 came to Jerusalem, and one of the questions he asked was, how do you describe the Palestinian Intifada, the first Palestinian Intifada? And he said there is nothing like it in history. He has read a lot of history, and he said there's nothing like it in history. But he appreciates our Intifada. The whole world appreciates the Intifada. But up till now, not a single Palestinian university took the Intifada as a source of learning from the sources. And we can talk infinitely about how the Intifada can be the vision on which we can build. Thank you, Munir. We can continue this discussion when we move to the second axis of our seminar. We will conclude with the first topic with Nisreen. Hello, Nisreen. Nisreen will tell us how they work in visualizing Palestine and how they look at radical education through their work in visualizing Palestine. Nisreen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much to the organizers. My name is Nasreen, and I joined Visualizing Palestine this past year as an information designer, which means I work more in the production and graphic design side of our organization. Our mission is to create data-led educational visual stories that put forward Palestinian narratives and histories. Our visuals are tools that anyone can use to educate and communicate the messages of the movement for Palestinian liberation. But to wind it back a bit, my experience started with my organizing as a student activist in New York City. So in terms of the tradition of radical education, that experience was situated within the tradition of peer-to-peer student education that happens outside of the sort of more disciplined forms of education that we experience in the university. In terms of like directly through communication and conversation, challenging and changing the political consciousness of our peers. And when I was a student, the tools that VP made, their visualizations, their posters, were very helpful for explaining through these very compelling, visual means, the structural aspects of settler colonialism and apartheid and the Palestinian experience. So I want to talk about what VP does in terms of its legacy and in terms of its approach to accessibility. So in terms of the tradition of radical education and design, there's of course a rich history of archives of poster art, films, illustrations to communicate the Palestinian cause, created both by Palestinians ourselves, but also by an internationalist base of support. And I think something like the Palestine Poster Project Archive is a great place to see kind of where a lot of the history and precedents that VP draws on. And in the past 10 years, we're also situated within the resurgence of and turn to data-based storytelling and journalism, which has long roots going back to the sociologist and socialist W.E.B. Du Bois' data portraits of Black American life, which represent one example of the long history of efforts to visualize marginalized communities through the communication of data in accessible forms. So in terms of accessibility, one of the big focuses of Visualizing Palestine is the desire to move beyond the gatekeeping and inaccessibility of information. On the one hand, we have traditional forms of media, particularly in the global north, that exclude Palestinian voices. And on the other hand, oftentimes research, data, reports are trapped in the information within them, which is dense and empirical, is trapped within, sort of long form, text heavy reports that often don't get downloaded and read. So VP sees part of its role in taking that information and synthesizing it into easy to access and understand visual content that can also, reach people who are visual learners, who communicate visually, and give them like accessible visual resources to explain Palestinian issues. So to us, that's what radical education can mean. It means getting at the root, going beyond news headlines and looking at the structural aspects of, sort of not even abstract, but sort of difficult to visualize concepts, sort of like the structure of apartheid or the structure of colonialism, and communicating that within the movement. So in this idea of, producing within the movement and for the movement. So that's this sort of tradition of radical education that Visualizing Palestine sees itself situated within.
Okay. Thank you, Nasreen. Shukran, Nasreen. Okay.
Thank you, Nasreen. Through the different interventions in the first axis, we could see that indeed there are a lot of traditions in radical education. Nabila said that when we use the Palestinian cultural heritage, we can safeguard our roots and build our dream of liberation. Abaher focused on going away of the traditional research and use the liberating knowledge in the learning process in universities. Gustavo said that we should not use the word education and added that radical education means fleeing away from education to learn in freedom and learning from doing what we want to learn. And Munir said
الخروج من الشعور بالدونية
that we should enhance our self-worth and know our self-worth. And finally, Nisreen explained how in visualizing Palestine they are using the archives
لخلق بأدوات بصرية
and using visual material to tell the narrative of Palestine. Thank you very much. I would like now to move to the second axis, which has to do with the political imagination, because radical education is linked to political imagination. And we have to understand here how we can expand and deepen our collective political imagination. What are, according to you, the different possibilities related to changing the political imagination, and what is the role of political imagination in generating knowledge? I will give the floor to Nabila first. We cannot create a liberating political imagination without looking into the house of wisdom and what we mean by the house of wisdom that Gustavo mentioned. We have to change our relationship with our own knowledge. I mentioned that self-worth is important, and also we need to appreciate our cultural heritage. We are looking for our own knowledge, and we want to develop a knowledge that is in line with our reality and in line with the challenges in our communities. Therefore, we have to go back to the experiences we have known in our different lives when life was normal, because we do not only learn in school. Children learn everywhere in their daily life and their interaction with their communities, with nature. And I always say that I have learned sustainability and dealing with nature and sustainability through my interaction with my mom. And when I used to go pick time with my mom in the mountains, and she used to show me which plants I should pick and how to pick them without destroying the roots. So this shows the importance of sustainability and sustainable development. And this is how I learned it. I did not learn it as a theory at university. I have learned it by doing it, by living it when dealing with my daily life and daily activities. So recovering our self-worth and believing in our roots will allow us to deal critically with our experiences and would allow us to generate a modern knowledge, a modernized knowledge, a liberated knowledge that would contribute in creating the political imagination. This is why I mentioned the roots, and I mentioned creating a dream. And as Gustavo said, a dream can be dreams in plural. And this pool of dreams would feed our liberation. This is how we start to see the importance of pluralism, of respecting diversity and pluralism, respecting our different selves in order to create the dream and to create the future. We deal with early childhood, and the Palestinian early childhood is full of knowledge, but this knowledge was never documented, was never studied, and they do not even call it knowledge. At best, they would call it folklore, if they call it folklore, that is. So when you try to develop and educational thinking. If you do not criticize your heritage, you will not be able to develop the dream. Therefore, I say that a dream is developed and the political imagination is developed with the development of people and the development of our self-vision, of our self-worth, our respect of our heritage, embracing our heritage and being capable of initiating change. And that's why we say that liberation is not only liberating ourselves from the traditional knowledge we acquire at college. Liberation also means that we should be able to criticize ourselves and to criticize the knowledge we have taken, to develop it and to deal with it as part of building knowledge. So inherited knowledge and general knowledge and the intersection between both, and this communication between the inherited and the modern knowledge is in fact what creates the liberation movement and the modern thinking in its new components, which in turn will contribute in building the political imagination. Thank you, Nabila. Very well put, as we say in English. Abahir, Nabila mentioned the production of knowledge and criticizing our heritage. So, Abahir, how would you answer? Thank you. I think that the basic problematic in the political imagination is that we need to get out of it. We have a political imagination that is linked to disfiguring the colonial reality. We are living under occupation, while occupation is the most simple aspect of the colonial structure. The national Palestinian movement and the political imagination has only focused on the occupation aspect of the colonial structure. And we are living the consequences of that in the Palestinian territory. And a major part of the Palestinian generation think that we are living under occupation, and even the terminology they use is a terminology having to do with occupation. So the problematic is how to get out of all these ideas linked and to move to new standards and new perceptions. How can we overcome all this? Meaning, how can we get out of the nationalism to something more general? We have a Palestinian nationalism. We are defending a certain national narrative, facing the narrative of the colonial power. But what we need today is a regression and the interference in the private sphere. So part of the problematic we are living in this political imagination is this. It doesn't mean that this is the only imagination we have. There are other imaginations that are struggling, but they are being marginalized. Of course, there are beautiful initiatives that you are launching and other initiatives we're not aware of maybe, but we have to see how we can answer the colonial narrative instead of continuously generating the same narrative. And it is sad to see that the idea of dealing with a heritage as if it were part of a museum. For instance, we have a Facebook campaign today on traditional robes is a form of decline, dealing with our Palestinian heritage as a part of a museum and taking them only when in certain celebrations is very sad. We should be living that instead of archiving it or showing it in museums or on specific occasions. So let us wear our traditional uniforms in our everyday life and not only on specific occasions. So part of creating this new imagination should be done away from the political, purely political imagination. We have to believe in the collective work and in the collective space instead of each working on an individual track and for an individual or private success. So once again, I think that we have to see how we can generate a new political imagination. Of course, the Palestinian cause is part of this word, but there are also things related to equality, liberation, justice, and these are not only related to our struggle against the colonial power. This is important, but there are other social struggles that should go in parallel to our political struggle, while sometimes we think that they are of a lesser importance. Thank you, Abaher. Gustavo?
Thank you. As you probably know, we have been occupied by the United States for a long time. We have the world record of American military interventions. But the Americans discovered that the best way to occupy us was not to occupy physically the country, but to occupy our souls, occupy our minds, occupy our political imagination. Then our struggle for liberation starts really with the struggle for political imagination. And we started to look for references. And of course, the first references was Palestine. And we were inspired by Intifada and many other political initiatives of the Palestinians. But we had the fortune to have the Zapatistas with us in January 1st, 1994. And since then, they have been really nourishing our political imagination day after day, really creating a new political imagination, first to liberate that imagination, and second, how that imagination implies to create real liberation of our bodies, of our lives, of our way of being within the dominant system. Because the dominant system is still there, because still there we have the occupation of the United States, because we have the Mexico state, we have all these elements of occupation, and of course we have capitalism. And then we have been working with them in how to produce, how to nourish in a different way our political imagination. Of course, this implies knowledge production. And again, the Zapatistas are, for us, the real example. They say that there is no separation between theory and praxis. They take a decision, they have an assembly and take a decision, they do something, and immediately after that they have a reflection of what they are doing. And they are appealing to all kinds of theories and elements and experiences of the past and the present to nourish that political imagination and their own practice. We talk in Universidad de la Tierra of reflection in action. Our reflection, our theoretical work, our knowledge production is clearly associated with action. There is one important question here. It is usually associated political imagination with the creation to foster an utopian imagination. And we are saying that in a very precise way, we are back from the future. That the left and the struggle for liberation has all the time associated the struggle with an image of the future, with a construction of a kind of utopian society. And we are working towards that goal. We are doing everything for that goal. And all kinds of means are accepted because the goal is good. The goal is revolution. The goal is the construction of this new society in which we dream. And then we are abandoning that approach. We are no longer thinking in an utopian world in the new society. You know very well that conversation between Chomsky and Foucault, that Chomsky insists in the construction of an utopian world, and Foucault observes that we are contaminated. All our images of the future are contaminated by the conditions of the dominant system. And then we need to liberate ourselves from that specific construction. And perhaps we will be able to talk a little more about how the Zapatistas are constructing in the present the new society, how the struggle is concentrated and not going to some place, but struggling today to create today what we need to create. Because in the conditions of the climate and institutional collapse, that is the only option to survive. The only option to really live is to construct right now, here among us, the new society that we need to construct. That is the meaning of the new political imagination that we are trying to construct.
Thank you, Gustavo. شكرا Gustavo. رح نحاول ما نستعمل خلق المستقبل ونركز على الحاضر.
We will try not to focus on the future, to focus more on the present. Munir, 5 minutes. Munir, are you with us? You should unmute yourself. You have 5 minutes, please. For me, and I carry this since 1971, I can tell you that the deepest political action is for a child to consider that he is a reference and not only a consumer. How can we achieve that? I have worked for 5 years in schools from 73 till 78. And in 67, I was criticizing the educational system. And therefore, I used to start with very simple questions. I would ask a child, 1 + 1 = what? And they would look at me and wonder, are you serious? He would answer 2, and I would tell him, are you sure? He says, of course I'm sure. Then I will bring, I start dropping waters on the table, and I tell him, how many drops do you see? He says 1. Then I add another drop, and I ask him, now, this is 1 drop plus 1 drop. What is the total? He would not answer. The teacher told them 2, and in the book it is written that 1 + 1 equals 2. But their eyes are telling them that 1 drop plus 1 drop is only 1 drop. So I always used to tell them the story of Jahab. His neighbor came to borrow his donkey. Jaha told him, I am sorry, someone came before you and already rented the donkey. So so the neighbor told him, yes, but I can hear the donkey behind the house. So the man told him, are you going to believe your ears or to believe the neighbor? And this, and in schools and everywhere, we are believing the authorities. The books they are giving us are the authority. The teacher is the authority. The educational system and grading system are all authorities. So the question is,
قعدوا فترة طويلة و300 صفحة حتى برهنوا منطقيا.
We know that it took long hours, even years, to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. And I, for instance, when I was in school, I used to ask all these questions, and later on, I started looking at things differently, and this is why I changed the narrative with the children.
Also, after I discovered that my mother knows math like nobody else, not even those who have a PhD in mathematics or engineering, because she used to be able to make clothes, design clothes for women. The most difficult structure is that of a woman's body, but how did she figure that out when she was presumably illiterate? So I discovered that I was a colonialist, and my weapon was the math of the Euro-American tribe, because I saw that my mother doesn't understand this math. She knows nothing about this. So I started to emancipate myself from being a colonialist whose weapon is math. I think this is the profound depth of what political means, to liberate oneself from the hallucinations of hegemonic civilization. It's hallucinations when they say 1 + 1 = 2, and they think that's a universal truth, when in fact it's only true in stupid things. Well, 5 minutes are over, so Nisreen.
Thank you so much. This conversation has been extremely interesting. I want to return again to my, I guess based on the conversation, to my experience as a Palestinian student in an American university, which I think my experience was not an uncommon one in being confronted by people, peers, and oftentimes instructors or people in position of authority who would tell you that the Palestinian historical narrative is illegitimate. And I think, like many other Palestinians, my impulse was to turn towards knowledge and intellectualism as a way to justify our experience and our historical narrative and our existence. And to me, this is one of the paradoxes of sort of radical knowledge sharing or production. It's this idea of using knowledge as like a shield or a weapon, rather than using knowledge as a kind of garden or a way of fostering a utopian imagination. But I think this goes back to, Maysoon, what you were saying at the very beginning about the role of careful strategic intention. I think at an organization like Visualizing Palestine, and in the way that I experienced, using their materials as a student, it was about equipping people with tools for, as Gustavo said, ending the occupation of our political imagination, and the way that that manifests very materially in the exclusion of Palestinian narratives. So to me, the role of knowledge production within the movement is this idea of building collective understandings, of creating the foundation of a utopian imagination by prioritizing a sort of collective unlearning, as has been discussed, and then moving into this space of, radical, expansive knowledge production. And also making connections sort of beyond our own context and opening new grounds for making connections and building imaginations for a shared radical future. So what this looks like materially for Visualizing Palestine is initiatives like our upcoming series on environmental justice. So understanding what the climate crisis looks like in the Palestinian context, what ideas like sustainability or climate vulnerability look like within the Palestinian context, but also bringing Palestine to the larger context of the climate crisis. So imagining at the intersection of climate change and internationalism, and placing the Palestinian imagination within a global imagination. And I think also what's critical for Visualizing Palestine is this idea of bringing designers and creators to the forefront and applying creativity to active struggle beyond the sort of rigid sort of bounds of productivity, that come out of spaces like the university. I think it excites people to see creative energy, and I also think it exists everywhere in the most quotidian acts of daily life. So I think in line with what Nabila was saying about pluralism, part of what we're trying to also focus on is broadening the visual language of the movement. So drawing on the established symbols of the Palestinian national imaginary, while also challenging ourselves creatively and expanding and thinking to meet the needs of the movement and of liberatory pedagogy more generally. Thank you.
شكرا كثير. كمان في كثير نقاط مختلفة.
Thank you very much. I think there are different points that were mentioned in response to the second theme. Nabila started by saying that political imagination is not simply about liberation from colonial knowledge, but also locally produced knowledge. Abaher continued to say that we need to go beyond the current political imagination to go and to respond to the colonialist narrative and to create a new political imagination based on the Palestinian reality, so collective versus individual, etc. Then Gustavo said that we need to also start by liberating our political imagination in order to create a new political imaginary. And he said that we cannot talk about the future, but focus on the present. How do we build the present? And then the future will come eventually, how to create. Because the colonial discourse always talks about creating the future, we need to focus on the present. And Munir said that we need to liberate ourselves from colonialist knowledge, which is to liberate ourselves from the hallucinations, the beginning of creating a new political imagination. Nisreen, creating a new political imagination that connects liberation movements all over the world, not only in Palestine. And she talked about
البيئة. اوكي شكرا. شكرا. بس هيك هلا شكرا كثير. هلا بنتقل للمحور الثالث هو
Now we move to the third theme, which is the struggle for liberation. Education is now disconnected from liberation, and this applies to radical education as it applies to other types of education. What are the ways that we can connect radical education with liberation movements, and in particular, the struggle for national liberation, which is crucial for Palestine and other places around the world? What are the options or possibilities for globalizing the struggle for liberation, and how can radical education play a role in forging these global connections? Global but anti-global. Nabila. I think that the main issue that Abaher referred to, I talk about the dream and constructing the dream, but it also needs values. And it is based on values. And as Gustavo said, you can't build a dream without being liberated. It's liberating yourself today. And this is why we need to focus on ourselves. We need to focus on reality, to focus on now, from looking at values, and we need to liberate ourselves from the occupation of the self, because there's the occupation of the land, but there's also the occupation of the human being. And that is also something that we need to liberate ourselves from. So between liberating ourselves from the occupation and colonialist occupation, and also liberating ourselves from the individual occupation, this is what we do on a daily basis. Abaher mentioned the campaign for the Palestinian dress or embroidery as if it were putting it in a museum, but it's not about that. It's about how this part of our identity, how do we bring it back to life? How do we practice it every day? These are our daily struggles. And it's these struggles that will build the future, but they need to be grounded in clear values, values of justice, and equality. Without having these values, without it being grounded in these values, we can never construct the dream. When we say that we want to liberate ourselves from the occupation and then be ourselves occupied, then we haven't changed anything. This political imagination will lead us to the abyss. We celebrate our colonialist expeditions when we were colonized Spain, for example. So what, and this goes against the values. So we need to think again about this. I think that the daily struggle based on values is what will enable us to communicate and interact with all the other people who are fighting for justice and equality around the world. Globalizing our struggle should be based on these values. My second point is that it's important for us to know that there's no hierarchy in the struggle. As a Palestinian woman, as a Palestinian feminist, I think it's important to say that all the struggles are equally important. I can't say that one is more important than the other. So fighting against violence against women is something that we should put aside until we are liberated from the occupation. No, all of these struggles are interconnected. And the common thing is values. So the struggle is based on values, it is not hierarchical, and it needs to be globalized. We need to have global connections and global solidarity around the values. And this is how we can liberate ourselves from colonialist structures. Thank you. Thank you, Nabila Abaher. So Nabila now responded to you. You can respond now. Thank you very much. I think that Nabila and I are in agreement. I think that if I'm going to try to answer your questions, this is all connected to the commonality between us, and that is reclaiming the self and getting out of this feeling that local knowledge is less than the knowledge of colonialist powers. We need to unlearn, we need to go beyond the shackles of colonialist knowledge. I think we need to reclaim the daily life. We need to reclaim our life, our daily life, because this is what gives us wisdom. Our daily life, not as it is expressed in schools when we talk about social sciences, but I'm talking about living on a daily basis and how that living helps us rethink. We need to go back to the field. We need to go back to the streets. And this is what will give us the compass. Our compass should always be the field, the ground, what is happening on the ground, the reality. The second part of your question has to do with globalizing struggles. Certainly, since the beginning of the first Intifada and the following Intifadas and Arab revolutions, a good portion of us, of Palestinians and other Arabs, we started reconsidering this relationship between Palestine and the diaspora, because the collective Palestinian institutions were no longer active. So many Palestinians started to reconstruct relations with the diaspora, and as well as a relation with Arab networks and networks of the Global South. This led to several discussions about global struggles and cross-border struggles, which is, as you said, Maysoon, it's anti-global, but it is global at the same time. So universal or global, but it's anti-globalization. So I think a good part of what we can reclaim, as Nabila said, that there's no hierarchy in struggles. The Palestinian cause is very important on the global level, but there are other struggles, and these struggles need to be collective. We are not the center of the world. We can understand the world through Palestine, but also the Palestinian cause can also be understood through the other struggles around the world. There is a centrality of the Palestinian cause, but we cannot keep using the discourse of the victim. We are not just, yes, we are victims, but this is not the discourse that we need to be using. We have a just cause, but there are other just causes around the world that we can connect with. As Nabila said, struggle against colonizer does not mean that we don't have social struggles as well. There is violence in the Palestinian community. We need to fight against it. Of course, it is an extension of the colonizers' violence, but still we have this on the social level within Palestinian society. So we need to think globally, because this world is interconnected. There are struggles around the world. There's suffering around the world. We need to learn from them. We need to connect with them. We are not starting from zero. For many people around the world, Palestine, the Palestinian cause, was a central cause, a central struggle. And instead of thinking that Palestine is the only priority, we need to think of Palestine as one of many struggles around the world, and we just need to expand these networks of fighting for freedom and emancipation around the world. Thank you, Abaher. Gustavo.
أنت جزء من حالك. Yes.
Munir revealed it to me just a few minutes ago, why the Zapatistas are so strong. Because the Zapatistas know their values, and so they cannot perish. They really know their values. And when they started the uprising in 1994, they, in every event, in every public presentation, they were displaying the Mexican flag. And this was, first of all, that they were saying, we are not separatists. We don't want to create a Maya state or a Zapatista state within Mexico. We are looking for political liberation within Mexico. And this, the second point was, this implied we need to negotiate with the government, with the state. And they started the negotiations. And then they reached at a very complex, after a very complex process, the agreements of San Andres, the agreements for the government to respect their self-determination, their self-government, and all the other things. But successive governments of Mexico did not respect the agreements of San Andres. And the Zapatistas also observed that the government itself, the state, was falling apart. And it was not only Mexico's state, but it was all the nation states were falling apart, were vanishing. It is next to impossible today what is Mexico and what is not Mexico. A third of the Mexicans live out of Mexico. Some of them, many of them in the US, but many of them in places like Japan or the Middle East. What is Mexico? What remains? What can we call as Mexico today? And the Zapatistas started to look for a new political horizon. And this political horizon they discovered went beyond the national imagination, and was something different when they started to look, and was, of course, against patriarchy. Of course, as Nabila says, no hierarchy, not any kind of hierarchy, the elimination of all hierarchy in the families and the communities and everywhere. Elimination of hierarchy. Yes, it was anti-patriarchal, and it was, of course, it was anti-capitalist. We cannot imagine real liberation with capitalism there. And we cannot imagine real political liberation in the frame of the so-called democratic nation state. A democracy that is basically a fiction, that is not any kind of real democracy, as the democracy that we have in our communities. And then the Zapatistas continue to shape a different form of globalized political imagination. But it was not a new doctrine, a new utopian definition. It was, as they said very well, a world in which many worlds can be embraced. In Europe, visiting the North and discovering the Souths of the North, where they can have this anti-patriarchal, anti-capitalist, anti-democratic nation state as the new globalized political imagination for liberation.
Thank you, Gustavo. Munir.
Thank you, Gustavo. Munir. I want to start by saying that over the past 80 years of my life, I think that the first thing that we need to liberate ourselves from is the concept of national liberation, because the concept of national liberation distracts us from in-depth or more profound type of liberation. I want to take, for example, Sakakini. 125 years ago, or 100 years ago, he didn't talk about liberation. He talked about to stop following in other people's footsteps. He's talking about the roots. Rumi said, you might be looking among the leaves for what you can only find in the roots. National liberation is only on the level of the leaves of the tree and not the roots. The peasants of Palestine organized a meeting in 1936 to discuss education, British education. And they didn't describe it as imperialist or colonialist. They just said that the British education system is disintegrating the relationships within the family and with nature. Isn't that so clear? Of course, those who were educated probably laughed at them and said, oh, they're talking about the family, that education is tearing the family apart and tearing up the relationship between people and the environment. But this is what is crucial. I want to go back to the Intifada. Intifada is not about national liberation. It goes much beyond, and it is more profound than that. It is a liberation for a cultural horizon, and it's a celebration for something that I've been talking about for many years. It's about a vision, because I don't believe in objectives and strategies. I believe in a vision, and the vision that I have developed and have been trying to clarify for many years, and I can summarize in a trilogy, a holy trilogy, like the Holy Trilogy of Palestine. I have a holy trilogy myself about the Intifada. I think the Intifada, its strength on a social level is the mujawara, or situated learning or neighboring. They used to call it during the Intifada the neighborhood committees, and that was a kind of mujawara. And the main topic, the main thing that they worked on was their well-being. The relationships between them was the ultimate expression of well-being. They started to plant the land. They started to give each other, to exchange aid and experiences in a wonderful way. And everything that they learned was from the soil of the earth, of culture, of society, of psychological and spiritual. What is more wonderful than that? I think this is the most profound type of liberation. When Nehru asked Gandhi, he was upset with Gandhi, and he said, "You want to kick the English outside of India?" And Gandhi said, "No, I'm afraid that the British will leave India, but their institutions will remain." So the idea is that liberation is not from the British as individuals, because their institutions remain in India and Palestine and elsewhere. So let's look at a more in-depth type of liberation. Let's look at a liberation that is about reclaiming our dimension, the cultural dimension, our civilization. If we're only going to talk about 1/10 of Palestine as a state or 20%, we will continue to live in an illusion. We're talking about a cultural horizon. More than half the population of the world want to visit Jerusalem. And so we need to understand it from that perspective. Thank you.
Nisreen, شكرا منير.
Nisreen, thank you, Munir. Nisreen.
Thank you, and thank you everyone once again for these incredible contributions. I think when thinking about this question of how to link radical education directly with liberation struggles, in the context of visualizing Palestine, I think of three things: collaboration, funding, and language. So for collaboration, I think one of the ways that we try to link our work directly with the struggle is expressed through grassroots collaborations and responsiveness to the needs of civil society partners, grassroots organizations. So oftentimes when there's an organization that has created a report or a campaign or needs some support building out capacity or wants some way to give the information that they're trying to spread, a larger reach, we'll work with them to sort of develop a visual complement to the work that they're doing in order to bring the work and the campaigns to this broader audience, and trying to, in our visuals, to link directly to the demands of Palestinian civil society, whether that's sort of platforming this, perspective of BDS and what that looks like materially in different contexts, or highlighting other forms of protest and resistance. And then in terms of funding, I think this idea of accountability and transparency to our base is also very essential in terms of creating an organic and authentic, link that, we can be accountable to. So VP's core funding comes from our membership base, which was a model that we switched to a couple of years ago and now makes up the majority of how we fundraise our own operations. And what that means is that, we're sort of directly accountable to the people who are supporting our work. So that means that there has to be a constant and consistent effort to make sure that we're not, holding ourselves accountable to large foundation funding or this sort of support, but that we're, responding directly to the needs of the people who are supporting our work. And then third is language. So in terms of making these sort of trans-global, but also anti-global connections, of the 170 plus visuals that we've produced, they've been downloaded and used in 60 countries. And we always produce our visuals bilingually in English and in Arabic. And they've been translated, many of them, into over 20 languages. And our approach to translation also tries to empower others to sort of interact with our work. So our work is Creative Commons. It's already free to use and share and download, free of charge. And, anyone can use it. And that's the core of a lot of what we do. But also our approach to translation, the way that we do it is that there's like a link on our visual saying, do you want to translate this visual? And then you can basically submit a translation of the visual, and then we will sort of redesign it in the language that the translator has given us. So it's a way of, working with people who maybe want to use the visuals in their own local context and have the capacity to develop, a translation in a language that we as our team, which is a very small team, may not be able to do ourselves. But it's this way of creating a conversation between, the sort of activists and advocates and organizers who use our material, and then like the team itself, and maintaining these global interconnections in the spirit of transnationalism. Yeah, and I think I'll end there.
That's it. Okay. I think, sorry. شكرا.
Thank you. I would like to ask you all a question. It has to do with hope. Hope is part and parcel of radical education, and because it is hope that pushes us to work, to learn, to live. So maybe you can each tell me about the importance of hope as part of radical education from your own perspective. Nabila. If you want to talk about something, you should talk about love. Fine. So our love to our nation, to our nature, to our country. Love generates hope. Hope does not come ex nihilo. It is generated by love. So in the past, I used to think that my rage is my drive, and I used to tell them that I find my energy from my rage, from my anger, from my frustration. But then with time, I became more mature, and I thought that no, in fact, my drive is not anger. My drive is love, because love generates hope. And when we speak of the values on which we base our building of the dream, where do these values come from? Why do we value justice, equality? Why? This is because we love, because I love my community, I love my people, I love my nature, I love my country. This is why love is the driver, love is the engine, and love is the one that generates efforts and give us the strength to go on struggling, working, learning. And when I see a little child learning something new, and I see how excited he is, I am inspired to do more in my daily life. So yes, what I can say is that love is the major driver that generates hope. Thank you, Nabila. I would like to remind you that if you have any questions or if you have any comment to make, please tell us in the chat box. Abahir, are you with love, with hope, or with both? Of course, with love and with hope. I would like to focus on hope linked to societal change, because we know that societies change and this always generates hope. So because the bleak reality we are living is counterbalanced by our hope for a better future. And here I would like to use what Farabi said, the hope to be happy. We are seeking happiness, future happiness, and this happiness is a happiness that we make for future generations. Happiness can change the reality. 100 years ago, we used to think how the situation was from certain perspectives, and we look at the reality now, and this is what pushes us to be creative. And I would like to quote Gramsci as well. The idea that there is a pessimistic thinking, but there is an optimistic will, and it is the optimistic will that allows us to overcome these dilemmas. And every time at college or in the community, I see people being pessimistic. I think that if it weren't for this silver lining, this little bit of hope, we would remain where we are. Therefore, we have to think of the future. The future is much more beautiful than the present. Therefore, hope pushes us to work and pushes us to love, as Nabila said, for sure. And she expressed it very, very beautifully. Thank you. Gustavo.
50 years ago, Ivan Illich wrote that the survival of the human race depends on rediscovering hope as a social force. And I was fortunate enough to discover hope and love and social transformation, as Abba has just said, in the north of Colombia, in the Cauca Valley, with indigenous people, in a marvelous collective that were creating a whole new world in their own place now, today, creating really against the dominant system a different kind of world. And then we visited another, and another was doing exactly the same, but did not know about each other. And then with other friends, we decided to create something for them to know each other, to nourish each other, to learn from each other, and then to give visibility to them for others to be inspired by them. And then talking with a friend, we discovered that something was done in the similar way in India. And then we decided to create with them something that we call the global tapestry of alternatives. And that means it's not an organization, it's not a doctrine, it's just we are just weaving all these people at the grassroots that just for survival or in the name of all ideals are already creating a new world. And of course, this is an expression of love, love among themselves, love for Mother Earth, a reaction, a real reaction, a real way to stop the horror of the climatic collapse and the institutional collapse, the creation of a whole new world. And it is exactly what the Zapatistas discovered in Europe just during the last 6 months. There are many of these grassroots experiences around the world creating a new possibility, giving, nourishing our hope in the present, rediscovering hope as a social force, as Illich said 50 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo Munir.
بضل انسى تو انميوت. المهم ولدت في القدس.
I was born in Jerusalem in a house that still exists in 1941, so 8 years ago. I remember when we were little children there, we were next to a settlement called Mikor Hayim, and in this settlement there were weapons and we had no weapons. So when they used to start bombing us in our neighborhood, my parents would wake us up and hide us below the doors, because they think that if the house collapses, maybe the door arch would protect us because it doesn't collapse. I remember that we had spent nights and nights under the door porches. And then we had 1948, and then 56, and then 77, 82, 87, 30, 93, 94. And in all those instances, there was a collapse. And then, out of a sudden, movements would stem, and the cause would become a universal cause. Maybe the worst time when I felt the most frustrated was in 1993, 1994, when the World Bank became the illegitimate representative. So we had no control anymore over our own lives. And today, although we do not always mention that, today the region where we find most of the liberation movements is our region. This is weird because we are used to criticizing ourselves to an extent that we are not seeing anymore that there are liberation movements that are trying to work. The first time I visited Gustavo, it was in 2001 in January. So 20 years ago. I remember he told me about Ivan Illich. He told me that what he said is very beautiful. He said that the modern individual is an individual who moved from living in hope to living in expectation. In 1973, or rather before 73, in the Intifada, all Palestinians were living in hope and acting in hope. In 93, when we had ministries and so on, we started living in expectations, waiting for each ministry or expecting each ministry to do X or Y. So we moved from living in hope to living in expectations. And when we live in expectation, we are constantly pessimistic, concerned, and we do not, or we cannot do anything. And I would like to add to hope something else, the hospitality. Hospitality, or the greatest hospitality we can give to children and to youth, is listening. There is no synonym in English to isgha, which means listening. In English, they have no speaking and no listening. There is only writing and reading and all other things that lack life. Conversation. Is there anything more beautiful than the hospitality you find in a conversation? Thank you, Munir. Nisreen.
Thank you. When I think about the role of hope, I think about the sort of paradoxical approach that I take to my work, which is an approach that's kind of oriented towards its obsolescence in the future. This idea that I hope someday people don't need the visuals that we produce. I hope someday they just will be able to exist as a historical record and as an artifact of a struggle. But yeah, it's a kind of paradoxical sort of work where the hope is in hoping that we someday don't have to exist, while still, grounding ourselves in the pes-optimism of our present moment, where it's imperative on us to continue making these visuals and working with, with our communities and all of this. And one might think that, the imagination of a future decolonization might be difficult because we work mostly with data, and, data is about the sort of observational world and about things that you can sort of apprehend through study and in response to present day needs. But, some of our work, I feel, has oriented itself towards these, future hopeful, utopian possibilities. So we had one, which I'll end with, which is called Return is Possible, which is a tribute really to the speculative work of Palestinian historians and researchers who have researched depopulated villages. And we basically mapped out, in the visual, all of these, all of the villages that haven't been built over, and just visualizing, very concretely for people what this space looks like and what it could mean in terms of the future of return and the plans for return, and what historians like Salmoun Abu Sitta have, sort of really poured an enormous amount of energy into conceptualizing and building scenarios for. So when I think about hope and where our work can intervene in that, it's those two things. It's sort of paying tribute to how these historians of the past have helped us to build our vision of the future. And it's also about an approach to our work that really, hopes it doesn't have to exist someday. Thank you.
Thank you all. We have Isam Hajjaj. He wants to. Sorry, عفوا. عصام حجاج حابب يعمل.
I see that Isam Hajjaj would like to make a comment. So can you please give him the floor, Yamin or Reef? Oh, welcome, Isam. Can you hear me? Yes. Go ahead, please. Can you please introduce yourself? I am Isam Hajjaj from Gaza.
أنا تعرفت خلال هذا من خلال بدينا بالمجاورات بشهر 10 اللي فات.
I took part in the neighborhood activities. And what I would like to make 2 comments, and I will try to be brief. Truth is, we do not know our self-worth, and we are not willing to look deeply into ourselves and to look for our roots. The external toxins and the external contamination is affecting us, and we know that these are toxins, and we are not trying to resist them. We know that it is killing us, and we are not doing anything about it. Therefore, we have to go back to our heritage, to our roots. We have to go back to our fertile land to find hope. Isam, I think we are losing you. We are losing you. We cannot hear you properly, Isam. Do you hear me now? No. No, it's cutting a lot. Now it's a bit better. Please go ahead, but quickly.
الشغلة اللي كنت بحكي عنها قبل يومين كنا في مبادرة
2 days ago, I took part in a societal initiative in Rafah. We are losing you, Isam. Apologies, but we cannot hear you. The connection is very bad. Maybe you can connect later on. I'm sorry, but we cannot hear you. Apologies, Isam.
جيهان الحلو حابة.
Jihan الحلو has a comment. Can you please introduce yourself first? Jihan, the floor is yours.
أهلين.
Jihan? Hello, Jihan. Please start by introducing yourself. I worked for years in the Women's Federation and in the resistance in Lebanon and in the Palestinian camps, and I was an activist, and I have worked on women's rights and liberation struggle. And Vietnam, Algeria, and the other movements were a source of inspiration for us. In 2000, I became a director of a research center, and I am now working, or I am responsible of a branch of a library. And we are working now on inaugurating 2 libraries, one in Rafah on the borders and one in Mer Hanoun. drawing on my experience, I would like to say that our basic problem is that the most important learning we need today is to integrate the learners in discovering our reality, because most of us Palestinians do not know our reality. Why are we here today? When I was in Ramallah, I discovered that those who live in Ramallah do not know how many settlements are around them. Munir mentioned the Intifada. Why don't they know the history of the Intifada, and how did we go from the Intifada to Oslo? And when I was in Ramallah, the children in the West Bank had no idea whatsoever about our history in Lebanon. Once the daughter of someone in Fatah came and told me, yes, I know you were all thieves and gangs in Lebanon. So that's why I'm saying that it's very important for the learners to be part of the learning process, to understand our reality. You see that Israel is trying, on the one hand, to change our narrative and to steal our narrative, but they were not capable of doing that, because we are steadfast and we believe in victory. So now they are putting pressure on us, so that even the narrative that we are giving in schools or in NGOs or in individual initiatives, they want to destroy it. I know that you have had several important meetings, but the most important thing is to know our reality and to know our modern history. It is not enough to know about Balfour, etc., but modern history is paramount. They have to know that this Palestinian struggle has been going on for 100 years now, and now there are contemporary movements. Oslo was a catastrophe, even greater defeat than the Nakba, and the opposition does not have an alternative. Therefore, of course, I agree with you that we wear our traditional clothing. We remember how Palestine used to be before 48. We live in songs and our traditions. But what about the national project? It's not that it's not clear. It is clear, and people believe in liberation. But I think that we are fleeing forward. And by doing so, there is some frustration. And to comment on hope, a writer and his wife did interviews with Palestinian children. And once he asked me, I do not understand why. How come the Palestinian children are still hopeful? And I told him, I don't know. Maybe deep down, they do believe that they will win, because their cause is a just cause. So if we want to learn about education and learning, we have to talk about the reality in all honesty, without fear, without rounding the edges, and without worrying about whether the donors will give us or not. Because if we do not understand our reality, we will keep sinking more and more, and the future will be even worse. So this is something that should be debated largely. And at some point, we did launch an initiative in Palestine, and Nibal Stawabti was with us. And we were saying that we need an interactive education. We started a meeting. We have set outlines. But unfortunately, because I'm a refugee and I do not live in Palestine, I could not continue with them, and the others had their own occupations. They were busy with their daily narratives, with the challenges and difficulties. But yes, we could go back to this. Thank you very much, Jihan. Anything you would like to say? Do you have any comment on what Jihan said? Do you have something to say to give Jihan more hope?
No.
يعني أنا بس بدي أكد على اللي قالته
I would like to emphasize on what Jihan said. I deal with university students, and yes, it's true, they do not know their own history, and we all share part of the responsibility. I think that university professors and school teachers, we all share part of the responsibility, because it is up to us to teach our history, because a lot of people have no idea about our history. A few days ago, a student asked me, who is Haidar Abdel Shafi? So I looked at him. I honestly did not know how to react. Then I thought, I share part of the responsibility, even if indirectly. Therefore, we have to see how we can introduce them to their reality and how we can teach them their past and their history. This is a collective responsibility we all share. I would like to add that one of the tools can be storytelling. We can use storytelling in order to initiate dialogues about our history. What we have now is a beginning of a dialogue between the parents and the children about what happened. We have several stories about the nursery, about the tree, etc. But the objective is always to promote dialogue. So we have to recognize that there are several strategies that can be used, but all these strategies are in fact strategies aiming at continuous learning, so that in any sector and in any project we can use that. And of course, if we do not know our roots, and Munir mentioned the branches and the roots, and I always insist on the necessity of knowing our roots. And I do not only mean the geographical roots, but also our civilizational roots, our narrative. And this should be part and parcel of everything we do. And even the curricula we have now do not allow for such a space to know ourselves, and therefore the young generations are in exile from their own reality. And this is a collective responsibility. As you said, there are a lot of silver linings, but the current initiatives are not pooled, and therefore maybe we need to introduce people to all these initiatives, to all these activities that we find, in fact, which allow us to celebrate our capabilities and all the potential that can create hope, and which, as I said, is based on love.
I would like
Gustavo,
also
yes.
Gustavo, yes, go ahead.
Illich also said that neither reform nor revolution can produce the change that we need, as we have seen for 100 years. He said what we need is a new story, a new narrative, packing past, present, and future in such a way that can be a new source of hope. That is what we need today. And I must tell you that I am seeing, I am breathing, I am smelling here that formulation of the new story. Please organize more radical Fridays and Mondays and Tuesday, every day of the week, please. This is it. This is what we need.
Thank you, Gustavo. شكرا, Gustavo. حدا بحب
Thank you, Gustavo. Munir. Okay, Munir, and then the first time I met Maysoon was in 1997, when I was beginning a project called Qalb al-Umur. And Qalb al-Umur was took the form of magazines and films to be made by children and youth without workshops, without training. And I spoke to many people in different Arab countries, and Maysoon was the first one to really take this, to understand the spirit of Qalb al-Umur. And she was working at the time with children in Shatila camp. And the children of Shatila camp, they published several magazines, and every child wrote, expressed themselves. So what I want to say is that mujawara, situated learning, neighboring, is the basic, is a cornerstone of any society. It's a building block for society. We cannot stay away from mujawara. It is the spirit of society. It is
المجاورة في قصص كل متجاور وإنه هذه القصص كلها متساوية.
When we connect the stories of everyone who is part of mujawara without any hierarchy, without any story being better than the other, without any evaluation, if we do that, I think we will get there. We started this in Palestine in 1971. My life in Palestine from 1971 till now are all mujawaras, and I never called them that until I met with Muhyiddin al-Abbad in Egypt, and we started talking about this, and he said, what you're talking about is the mujawara. And I started using that term. That was in 2004. It was the first time that I hear that it described as such. So what I want to say is that what we really need is already there. And it existed in Palestine since Palestine was fragmented. They sometimes used to call them political cells or revolutionary cells, but the most beautiful mujawaras are the ones that read reality, that understand reality. As you said, Jihan, they write their stories. And as Gustavo said, I start with my story about reality today. And when I write about the present, I will inevitably connect it to the past and the future. Civilization starts with now, with the presence of the past and the future, and a cultural horizon, and also readiness. When we talk about the present, being present is also being ready. All of these components are connected also to hope, to understanding reality, and it starts from each person telling their own story and connecting their reality today with the past and the future without using any term that is academic or institutional, because they are polluted terms. Let's keep them aside. Thank you, Munir. Nisreen.
Yes, I was thinking of two things during this conversation. One, which is about the origins of visualizing Palestine, which actually was born out of the founder Ramzi, going to the West Bank for a conference and realizing that he was incredibly ashamed by the sheer amount that he had not known going into the conference, and that's sort of motivating him to say, okay, what is needed in order to make this information accessible, in order to facilitate radical pedagogy that can exist outside of, institutions that exclude the Palestinian narrative, and how to globalize the struggle through that. And the second thing I was thinking about was what the professor Joy James has to say about sort of the role of children in radical political imagination, because the way that she talks about it, the children are uncompromising. If you've ever been around a child, that they don't capitulate. They're vulnerable, and they also have, they know what they want, and they provide, a model of this sort of, desire to live a life free from pain and free from oppression. And as we get older, we learn to compromise and capitulate and make concessions that we must make for survival. But I think the role of children in our political imaginary is to reintroduce that kind of uncompromising desire to live a life free of pain and oppression. So I think that's, again, comes in.
Thank you. شكرا نسرين.
Thank you, Nasreen. Now I would like to give the floor to Samia Khouri, and she'd like to make an intervention. Please introduce yourself. You're welcome, Samia. Please unmute yourself.
أنت muted. Okay. ممكن
سامعيني هلا؟
Can you hear
مسموع؟
me? Yes.
أنا متقاعدة هلا.
I'm retired. I'm a retired grandmother, but I worked in the field of education for a very long time. And I've dedicated my life to doing voluntary work in different organizations, and the latest was Rawdat al-Zuhur, which is also a school. What Jihan referred to now, and Munir also, this thing about reading and listening. The parents no longer listen to their children, and the children don't listen to anyone, and they're not reading. I think this is one of the problems, not knowing, they don't know their reality because they're not reading and they're not listening. I believe that new technology, mobile phones, WhatsApp, they no longer read nor write. Yesterday, I was telling a young man, I asked him to write down a phone number because I cannot see. And then I saw his handwriting, and I said, what is this terrible handwriting? And he said, well, nobody writes with a pen anymore. So I was really amazed because this new generation is a generation that doesn't listen to anyone and nobody listens to them. As Jihan said, I think post-Oslo, Oslo was a major catastrophe for us. I hope, and I wrote this, life would be very difficult to live if it weren't for the ray of hope, which is a famous saying in Arabic. Everything we do is useless. I'm really grateful for these webinars and that refer to very important subjects. And I think that it's extremely important to focus on the relationship within the family at home, that people talk about what's happening. When somebody says, I don't know who Haidar Abdel-Shafi is, and Haidar Abdel-Shafi played a very important role in the Palestinian national movement. This is truly unfortunate. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Samia. You referred to a subject that would be interesting to take back to the panelists, our guests, and that is, how can we fight, perhaps, or how can we use technology for radical education? Who would like to start and comment on this? Gustavo, would you like to comment on this?
You're muted.
Yes, you know, I hate Zoom. I hate really Zoom, and I try to escape from Zoom every time I can. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that Zoom is allowing us to have this conversation. And the question is how we can use the tools instead of being used by the tools. We have become subsystems plugged into the system. And we can see that with the children now this year, because of the pretext of the pandemic, plugged into the screen and ceasing to live, ceasing to learn, ceasing to experience life. The real challenge is how we can really use the tools instead of being used by the tools. All these technologies, all these new technologies are particularly threatening. And we need to have the spirit of sufficiency and to have a kind of austerity in the use of these tools, to use them really as tools and not be used by them.
Thank you, Gustavo. Maybe Nisreen, لأنه أنت بتشتغلي
Nisreen, because you work in visuals and technology, can you comment on this, please?
Of course, I think it's a relationship of tension, but it can be a productive tension, particularly when it comes to social media. I think, at least speaking personally, I wouldn't have experienced the last uprising in May the same way if I hadn't been experiencing it, you know, in part through social media, over Instagram, through the work of activists who were using these platforms, which are biased against us, which are biased against Palestinian narratives, whose algorithms and admin structures, you know, kind of are oriented against, you know, Palestinian narratives but at the same time, you know, despite that, it still was a very valuable and vital platform for one, circumventing the mainstream channels of knowledge circulation and media, you know, that are in many ways clearly intellectually, politically, economically biased against, you know, an anti-colonial framework. So yeah, I think it's a tension because it's a hostile medium, but at the same time, it's a very important one. And I think part of the work that we try to do in VP is to assess and manage that tension to the best of our ability, to make use of these platforms, these technologies to the extent that we can, but also try to keep ourselves grounded in the needs of our base and what they're asking from us. You know, sometimes what is needed is something that exists digitally. Sometimes something that's needed needs to exist on paper. It needs to be something that can be handed out. It needs to be something that can be used in a classroom or at a protest. So these are many of the things that we keep in mind when we approach this work.
Thank you. شكرا نسرين. نبيلة بتحبي تحكي؟
Thank you, Nisreen. Nabila, would you like to comment? I just have one comment. Any learning, if it is not meaningful to the learner, it will create alienation. And this is what we see in all the official context of educational contexts. They create alienation. So whether technology or not, the example that Nisreen gave, for example, in May, the young men and women used tools that were inherently against us, including TikTok, as a means to make our voices heard, make our narrative heard. So because they controlled the content, they managed to provide content. They saw the role and the importance of that role and to present it there. So if we can find such spaces, let us use them because they are meaningful and the young men and women will be creative, will use them creatively. This is something that we can do, of course, but the young people can do it much better than we do. And they can manage to transmit these messages that we really need to reach the widest possible audience. And since these are the tools that can transmit these messages, then we have to use them. And I think that they can be useful. Thank you. Abaher, would you like to add anything, or Munir? In brief, just to confirm what was said, technology can be a new means for creating knowledge, for transmitting knowledge. Perhaps it's a bit more democratic because it provides access to everyone. However, it's also a bit complicated because it can backfire when it becomes easily accessible. The information may not be verified, but I think this cyberspace can be a tool for democratizing knowledge and providing access to knowledge. There was another thing that the colleagues also mentioned that I will not elaborate on. Our presence is important to provide alternative information and to become lobby groups. We need to be influential. I understand that we can be victims to this unjust regime that is controlled by these big corporations, but we can use it for our interest.
Thank you, Amahir. Munir, I think that we should not forget the word wisdom. Should we use technology or not? We can use it, but with wisdom, because without wisdom, there are no experts. Wisdom sets the context. I think that life on Earth cannot continue if we do not recover wisdom in our lives. I can give you an example about the difference between wisdom and knowledge. The UK made a great invention when they created the water flush, because in our Levant but it was not wise. It was not a wise invention, because in the Levant we might have this brilliant invention, but we have no water. The first time I went to Gustavo, I slept in his house. It was the first time I discovered a dry latrine. I did not need to use any water. So yes, there are alternatives, but they are not money-generating alternatives. Therefore, they are not well known. But in the Levant, this is a survival issue. So we have to see how we can restore wisdom in our life and our discourse and everything. Wisdom is, as we said, or the House of Wisdom, as we said in Baghdad, was a beacon of light. We have 200 people teaching mathematics, useless classes of math, but there was not a single place for to teach a single course that made sense. We have a lot of mathematics classes, but they are useless. So wisdom, again and again. Thank you, Munir, Arish, and Mahmoud. 2 minutes each, please. Please introduce yourself. I am Arish. I am a researcher in the Colorado Boulder University, and I am specializing in the education sciences and education for critical technology. And I would like to comment on several things that were said. In the past, I learned a lot from reading for Mr. Munir, and I thought how we could merge between all the ideas relating to how to reassess the educational environment and how to integrate between that and technology. So it was extremely inspiring for me to read what Mr. Munir has written, and I tried to use it in my life. When we think of technology and our education on critical technology, we have to take into account that on the one hand, children or Palestinian students need to have access to these tools in order to understand their technological reality, not only as tools, but also as designs, how our life is being designed by this oppressive technology. For instance, how movement is designed and how control is designed, how they are controlling the movement of people, how they are putting constraints on their interaction with their environment. The second idea raised by Nisreen has to do with the software. We have to understand how it is controlling us on the one hand and how they are biased on the other hand. And at the same time, we should tell the students that you can overcome these tools, and there are practices that and the things we can do on the content and on the technical aspects in order to overcome all that. And this leads me to hope and education based on hope and for hope. Thank you.
آخر حدا معنا هو محمود الشاعر.
Mahmoud Shair. Good evening.
اسمك شاعر.
Are you a poet or is it just your name? Because your name translates into poet. It is my family name, Al-Shair. Yes, it does mean poet. And I am from Gaza. I am the director of a project called Newsletter 28. I have a comment that might need more than 2 minutes. Fine, then 3 minutes. I would like to thank you for this interesting discussion. I think that dealing with all these issues in education and tackling our behaviors and the behavior of our communities require empowering people and creating a space where people can have this kind of dialogue where they can develop their potential and their creativity. I was born in 1990, and I remember when I was a child that I used to spend a lot of time either in the library, which was inside the mosque, or in the agricultural land where I could play in the open outdoor in the open space for 3 or 4 hours with my friends. Today, I think we have to take into account that the daily presence of technology in the life of children is depriving them from a space where they can think and play and be creative. So we have to rethink the space. We have to re-empower people in order to adopt practices that would enhance their ideas or their idea of freedom that would allow us to tackle all these problems. I also agree with Mrs. Nabila when she says that we should be proud of our individual successes and of each other's successes, and that we should support one another by encouraging one another, and that we could form lobbies pushing the others to succeed. Finally, I agree with Mr. Abahir with regards to being capable of forming groups that can achieve interventions in our communities, whether on the formal level or on the informal and between the individuals. I thank you for inviting me, and I thank you for this space of interaction. Thank you, Mahmoud. Before concluding, I would like to ask our speakers whether they have something to conclude with. Nabila, do you have anything to conclude with? Nabila, I would like to say thank you. Thank you for this intellectual interaction, for this intellectual space you are opening. And we hope that it will create new spaces of learning, of thinking, in communicating in a trans-border and transcontinental kind of communication. Thank you, Nabila. Thank you for your participation, Abahir. Well, thank you very much. I was very happy to see colleagues from different backgrounds and from different places. And I have learned a lot. And I would like to thank Mrs. Nabila because such dialogues enlarge our horizons and inspire us. So thank you once again. Thank you, Abaher. Gustavo, Munir.
Yes, I am convinced that in the current conditions of the world, before radical uncertainty, friendship, hope, and surprise are the keys for the construction of a new world. And I have experienced during the last 2 hours friendship, hope, and surprise. Thank you.
Thank you. منير
بدي اقول عاود ارجع الشيء الهائل اللي موجود حوالينا ومش عم
I would like to go back to the fact that Algeria stayed 130 years under a criminal colonialism, and today it is recovering and helping others to recover. A lot of things happened in the Arab world, in Arab regions, in Arab countries. But right now, Gaza, Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, but Gaza and Yemen more specifically do not have anything at all. And all the stories we have written in the past they cannot measure with the struggle of Yemen and of Gaza. Maybe we need to write new narratives and new stories that would be stronger than the Iliad. We are living today a historical moment, and what we are living does not only trigger sadness. It also triggers a great hope for the world as a whole, much greater than any other epic we could read about. And I am communicating with Mahmoud, Isam, and other groups in Gaza. And I am very comfortable. I am most comfortable when I communicate with them. Thank you, Munir. We said that. Thank you. Yes, we understand when you say that you favor the people of Gaza. Nisreen?
Yes, I don't have too much else to say except thank you. It was an extremely humbling and gratifying experience to be sharing this panel with all of you. And again, my thanks to the organizers for putting together this series of events and interventions that I think will be a very formidable archive for people to look back on.
Okay. شكرا ونحن بدنا نشكركم باسم
Thank you very much. We also would like to thank you on behalf of the Arab Education Forum and Rosa Luxemburg. We thank you all. We thank all those who have related their experiences, who taught us, and learned from us. And we thank those who took part in the previous sessions as well. And as Nisreen said, this is maybe the last in a series of seminars. But this chapter is over maybe, but the story is not. And if you have any stories or experiences that you would like to share, please do not hesitate to send them. And because archiving is also part of radical education for a wider liberation. I would like to thank Yamin Omar, Rimki Wan, Rif Fakhouri, and we also thank Sirine Halaili and Naila for their interpretation. Thank you all, and we hope to meet you again. in other spaces. Thank you.